The time we call the millennium, the prophesied millennium in the Old Testament, began 2,500 years ago and lasted nearly 300 years. I am saying this time we call the millennium in the land of Israel began after the Jews returned from Babylonian captivity 2,500 years ago and lasted about 300 years. Let me explain. If we look at the millennial prophecies before the Babylonian captivity 2,600 years ago, and then we check to see if those prophecies were fulfilled following the Babylonian captivity, we could say the millennium began 2,500 years ago, which was 512 BC, and lasted nearly 300 years. The word millennium does not appear in the Bible, and the 1,000 years attributed to it do not appear in the Old Testament. So the millennium is not required to be 1,000 years, just a long time. The 1,000 years of Revelation 23, which Satan spends sealed in the abyss, is not required to be part of the millennium because the prediction was made 600 years later in a very different time. First, I will summarize the millennial prophecies and then look at their fulfillment 2,500 years ago. Briefly, 2,700 years ago, the people of Israel were taken captive to Assyria because they were a sinful, evil nation. The people oppressed each other, their words and deeds were against the Lord. 100 years later, the people of Judah were taken captive to Babylonia. There were several prophecies about this 2,700 years ago and 2,600 years ago by Isaiah, Micah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Zechariah. They prophesied the invasion of Jerusalem, the city laid waste, the inhabitants taken captive for 70 years in the Babylonian kingdom, and their eventual return from exile from the many nations where they had been dispersed. They also prophesied the quality of life in Jerusalem and Judah and their relationship with God after their return from exile. Prophesied life in Jerusalem and Judah and the land of Israel after the return from exile is what we call the millennium.
So here is a summary of the millennial prophecies from Isaiah, Micah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Zechariah, and they were prophesied between 2,700 years ago and 2,600 years ago. The Lord would raise up King Cyrus, who would set the exiles free, and the righteous would return. Jerusalem and the temple would be rebuilt. The ruins would be rebuilt and the towns resettled. The house of Israel and the house of Judah would be joined into one nation in the land with one king over them. The Lord would reign on Mount Zion. The people would acknowledge his holiness, accept instruction, learn his ways, and exalt his name. Rulers would rule in justice. Israel would be righteous, prosperous, peaceful, and a splendor to the nations. The Lord would make a covenant with many, and his spirit would be with them. He would destroy their enemies, and they would live long, healthy lives to the age of 100. The house of Israel and the house of Judah would be joined into one nation in the land with one king over them. They would speak the truth, render true and sound judgments in the courts, and would not plot evil against their neighbors, and were not to love perjury. Their pride would be humbled, and the Lord alone would be exalted. In the land of Israel, they would be cleansed of their sins, have a new spirit, a fresh heart, and keep God's laws. They would be his people, and he would be their God. They will beat their swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks, and they would not train for war any more.
So did this happen when they returned from captivity 2,500 years ago? Were these millennial prophecies fulfilled? Let us look at known history of the 5th, 4th, and 3rd centuries BC. The 5th century by Ezra, Nehemiah, and Malachi, the 4th century by Flavius Josephus' account of Alexander the Great and the Ptolemies, and the 3rd century BC by the letter of Aristeas.
Here is some 5th century BC history from Ezra, Nehemiah, and Malachi. For 70 years, 598 to 528 BC, Jerusalem lay desolate and in ruins, and the exiles remained in captivity and were dispersed throughout Babylon and the nations. In 538 BC, Cyrus, king of the Persian Empire, which at that time was all the kingdoms of earth, which included Assyria, where the northern tribes of Israel had been taken captive in 722 BC, that God's people anywhere could go to Jerusalem and build his temple. About 50,000 Jews returned to Jerusalem between 538 and 520. In 479 BC, Xerxes, king of Persia, decreed that any Israelites from his kingdom could return to Jerusalem with Ezra. The temple was completed in 512 BC, and it was the house of God. God began his reign from Mount Zion. In 479 BC, Ezra said, "The Lord had shown them grace and gave light to their eyes. The Israelites listened attentively and obeyed the law which they had finally understood. They confessed their sins, worshiped the Lord, and celebrated with great joy because they now understood the words that had been made known to them." By 461, Jerusalem and all the cities had been repopulated. They even made a binding agreement, a covenant, to follow the law of God given through Moses. Here is some 4th century BC history from Josephus. Alexander the Great came to Jerusalem in 332 BC. With Alexander's offer of favor, the Jews showed that their obedience with the laws of their forefathers was their highest priority. After Alexander's death in 323, Ptolemy Soter in Egypt knew the people of Jerusalem were most faithful in their oaths and covenants, and maintained their fidelity in Egypt by merely requiring them to take their oaths. 3rd century BC history. Ptolemy Philadelphus took the kingdom of Egypt in 283. He freed all the captives, numbering 100,000, some of which were ancestors of those taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar. He had so much respect for their good government and great wisdom that he wanted to make his kingdom best it could be through the help of their wisdom. He wanted an accurate translation of the Jews' books of the laws of Moses, so he invited 6 elders of every tribe of Israel over to Egypt to do the translation. So impressed with their wisdom, he held banquets in their honor. He asked each a question concerning good kingship. The answers to those questions can be found in the letter of Aristius to Philocrates. The 72 answers to 72 questions to 72 representatives of the 12 tribes provides a picture of life in the Jewish land at that time. From the letter of Aristius to Philocrates, every man legal officer humbled himself before the eyes of God to make decisions affecting himself and those around him. They believed every thought was known by God and no act of wickedness escaped his notice. Decisions were made according to God's will rather than self-interest or the interest of any man. Arrogance of men was non-existent. Glory went to no man, but only to God when men were successful. Men were not dazzled with fame, wealth, or power, recognizing these are the gifts from God. All rulers honored righteousness above all things. They recognized sound judgment and wisdom are gifts from God, and only by divine power can one receive all good and reject all evil.
We can see the land of Israel after the captives returned from Babylonian captivity 2,500 years ago very much fits the earlier prophecies 2,700 years ago and 2,600 years ago. But why did this time of peace and prosperity come to an end? This time when the righteous Jews from all 12 tribes maintained their covenant with God in the land of Israel, and God was exalted above all. Wasn't it supposed to last forever? According to the Dead Sea Scrolls, 4Q39 to Fragment 1, 7 Jubilees, which is 49 years after the desolation of the land, they would forget the law and the covenant and do what is evil in the Lord's eyes. Then the Lord would turn his face on them and give them into the hands of their enemies. 7 Jubilees after 586 BC is 243 BC. So the millennium lasted from about 528 BC to 243 BC, nearly 300 years, a very long time and older than the United States. All the details and references are in my book, Prophecy Paradox, The Case for a First Century End Time, and you can buy it at Amazon and find it in the link below.